Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Floating Wind, the Next Big Game. We've got just over 1,200 people signed up today, so thanks all in advance for joining us, and thank you to today's speakers, who I will introduce shortly. The webinar is one of several pieces of work that we're doing in conjunction with the US Offshore Wind 2019 conference in Boston on June 10th and 11th. So before we go into the webinar, I'd like to take this opportunity just to tell you a little bit more about the conference itself, where floating wind systems is going to be a main feature of the program. So the conference is all about US offshore wind project execution and supply chain expansion. This is a key area the industry has asked us to focus on in 2019. The event has 3 tracks. We have 80 plus speakers covering a vast range of topics. They include things like US markets, upcoming offshore wind projects in each state, fixed and floating wind systems technology, financing, construction and installation, permitting, stakeholder engagement and policy development, and plenty of other topics as well. The event is essential for any company that is looking to find partners or develop projects or enter the supply chain. And the second main component of the event is the US Offshore Wind Supply Chain Exhibition. This is where people can network and explore approximately 60 exhibitors who are all leading in the US offshore wind supply chain. And I've actually included the event brochure as a handout to this webinar, which you can download along with the slides for this webinar and the presentations upcoming. So, moving on to the webinar itself, I would like to welcome and thank today's speakers. First up, we will have Gunnar Herzig, a Managing Director, World Forum Offshore Wind, presenting some interesting data on global offshore wind markets. We have second up, we have Michael Jacobson, Managing Director with Serco, presenting on floating wind systems and the stepping stones to commercialization. And finally, we have Antoine Pfeiffer, Senior Manager, Global Supply Chain and Development at Principal Power, who will explain how floating wind can enable a paradigm shift in the US electricity sector. The webinar will last approximately 70 minutes. We'll do our best to finish on time, and we will send you the recordings in a couple of days, along with all of the slides. And I mentioned before, we have some handouts. You should be able to see on your screen some handouts where you can download those slides. And also, if you notice, there is a chat box on your screen. If you have any questions for the speakers, please type them in the box, and I will select a few of the best questions at the end of each presentation and put them to the speaker. So we hope to cover at least a few questions per presenter. So without further delay, I'm now going to hand you over to the first speaker. So over to you, Gunnar. I will now share your screen.
Great. Thank you very much, Adam. So I hope everyone can hear me well and can also see the slides. Perfect.
Yeah, we can see them well. Okay, over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much again for inviting me to this webinar. It's my great pleasure to talk about the offshore wind industry today. And yeah, as Adam already mentioned, my name is Gunnar Herzig. I'm the Managing Director of World Forum Offshore Wind, WFO. And yeah, so WFO actually, as you can see on the next slide, is a non-profit organization that was only founded last year in 2018, really with the aim to promote offshore wind globally. So I think this webinar fits perfectly because it's really our role to try to promote offshore wind in all of the new markets, so not only in Europe, but also in Asia and also the US, and not just to focus on conventional offshore wind energy, so bottom fixed offshore wind, but also floating offshore wind. And therefore, I think this is an excellent opportunity to tell more about offshore wind in general and where we are right now globally, and also where we are in terms of floating offshore wind. So just to round up on our WFO organization. So we are a non-profit organization focusing exclusively on offshore wind and representing the complete value chain. And we have an international setup with offices in Hamburg and Singapore. And if you have a look at our members, you can already see that some of them are already active also in the floating offshore wind industry. Innogy, for example, has announced an interesting floating offshore wind joint venture together with Shell and Stistal from Denmark. And Green Giraffe, for example, is already advising on floating offshore wind activities. So also among the industry, you can already see that there is really a great focus on floating, and it is really one of the big topics that are currently out there in the industry. Also, when it's about what we, when talking about what we actually do, we lobby, of course, for offshore wind worldwide, and of course also for floating offshore wind. Right now, for example, I'm actually in South Korea, in Seoul, where floating offshore wind is a very big topic. The same goes for Japan. Here we can really see that people are extremely interested in what's happening with floating, where we are with floating, what kinds of technologies are being developed. And I think the same would be true for the US West Coast, which is also one of the main markets in the future for floating offshore wind, and the same in certain European markets, for example, Spain, Portugal, or Norway, which are also markets very intensely looking into floating offshore wind. And that is also something that we talk about when we meet with government officials or politicians from those markets. When talking about conventional offshore wind, they are also always asking about floating. And I think that is really something that we see a lot, especially in those new markets where I think floating will have a particularly strong role. We also inform about offshore wind, and you can find some interesting information about the offshore wind industry on our website, and also, of course, about floating offshore wind. And lastly, we also, as a nonprofit organization, connect the global offshore wind community, so all the different players from the global offshore wind industry. And at our last big event in Taipei, for example, we had EOLFI from France, and represented by their president, who was telling us about what they do in terms of floating, and that was sort of a major part of our program. So I think in general, one can say that nowadays floating is something that's an integral part of the offshore wind industry and will only become stronger in the future. If we now have a look at where we are in terms of numbers right now, let's have a look at the global offshore wind capacity installed annually over the last 10 years. And we can clearly see this strong growth path from 2008 to 2018, especially with last year being a record year with pretty much exactly 5 gigawatts of capacity, of offshore wind capacity installed just during that year, bringing the total globally installed capacity to around 22 gigawatts. And I think that in itself is quite a good message. But of course, when it comes to floating does not really play a number in those figures yet. Those numbers are pretty much exclusively bottom fixed offshore wind. But of course, when thinking about the future, floating will definitely play a major role in the installed figures. And we can see that if we take a look at the next slide, where we can see the way forward, or at least a projection of where we could be in 2050. And this projection has been done by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and they estimated around 520 gigawatts of installed offshore wind capacity by 2050, which is where we derived our WFO mission 500 gigawatts by 50 from, which really means that on top of the roughly 20 gigawatts that we have right now, we need to add another 500 in order to really make sure that we reach the climate targets and that we can make the full use of the offshore wind potential globally. And of course, in those 500 gigawatts that need to be added over the next 3 decades, floating offshore wind will play a major role. Nobody quite knows, or nobody quite dares to estimate how much exactly, or even percentage-wise, how much of the increase of the added capacity in the future will come from floating offshore wind. But I think we're at this crucial moment in time where we're now about to enter the large-scale dimension for floating offshore wind, after we've seen some of the very impressive smaller scale projects. But I think then with the large-scale breakthrough for floating, it's sure that there will be many tens and hundreds of gigawatts of floating capacity added globally over the next 3 decades. And yeah, if we now zoom in to one area for floating offshore wind, which is extremely interesting, looking extremely interesting at the moment, that is actually the US West Coast. And here the US BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, published a call for information in October last year for 3 proposed areas off the coast of California. And the great news, which only came out last month in April, was actually that 14 companies from all over the world were interested in those projects and were deemed qualified companies to take a deeper look at those projects and see at those sites and see what can be developed in terms of floating. And when we look at the companies, the ones that are mentioned on this slide, those 14 companies, we can see a wide range from sort of smaller local developers to ranging to big international companies who are already active in Europe and North America, such as WPD, Avangrid, EDF, EDP, E.ON, Equinor, Northland Power. So many of the big players of the industry who are now already expressing an interest in floating offshore wind off the coast of California. And I think that was actually a great sign for the industry in general to see that such a market, which is sort of still in its fairly early stage, already creates such an interest among the industry and among the industry's biggest players. And I think that looks actually very promising. And the interesting question will now be, so what do the companies how do they view those sites, which are actually located in Northern California and then Central California? So those are the areas that have been selected by BOEM. And indeed, the interesting question is going to be what exactly is going to happen now and how long it's going to take. Because one thing that is definitely worth remembering, that with offshore wind, we're always talking about massive infrastructure projects, which are worth multi-billions of dollars or euros. So nothing ever moves very quickly. So it always requires a lot of preparation and serious efforts from various players to come together for such projects. So it's always worth remembering that those things do take time, and nothing will be built in California overnight. That's definitely something one needs to add. But I think the what we've seen in April with the interest from those 14 companies, that was definitely a very positive sign, I think, for 2 things: for the US offshore wind market in general, which has, of course, already a lot of activities going on the East Coast, but is now also moving to the West Coast. And the second aspect is, of course, the fact that this was great news for the floating community, because as California has such deep waters, only floating offshore wind will be possible there. And the fact that so many companies were interested in having a closer look at these sites, I think that was great news for the floating community, and really now makes clear that floating is not something, it's not a niche area of the offshore wind industry, which is only done in a certain country, a certain continent, but it's really something that is already happening in Europe, especially in Scotland with Equinor's Highwind project, but also something that's already very intensely discussed in Asia, especially in Korea and Japan, and now also in the US, especially California. And I think that's a great story for floating offshore wind in general. And I'm sure the next speakers will go into more details of what's happening exactly in California and what kind of technologies are looking most promising. But I think that's it from my side for today. And now I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any questions from the audience.
Gunnar, thank you very much for your insights. So let me just take a look, see if we have some questions here. So first question, when will floating offshore wind become cost competitive with conventional bottom fixed offshore wind?
Yeah, that's always a very interesting question. And I think it's always a bit tricky to come up with an exact date by when they will become cost competitive. I think when talking about costs for floating, it's always very important to remember the tremendously positive cost reduction curve that we've seen for conventional offshore wind. And I think that is really probably the single most important achievement for the offshore wind industry over the past 5 or 10 years, this cost reduction path. Because previously, even 5 years ago, the discussion for offshore wind was always, yeah, that sounds very interesting, but isn't it way too expensive? And that was really the killer argument from anyone not convinced by the benefits of offshore wind. The killer argument always was way too expensive, we'll always need subsidies, and therefore will never catch on. And I think what we've seen over the past years, especially with those cost reductions that came along with the auctions that have been conducted in several European countries, especially, for example, those zero bids that we saw in the Netherlands and Germany, but also the great reduction of prices we saw for CFD auctions in the UK. I think that has really convinced almost anyone who was previously opposed to offshore wind, because the industry has really shown that it can bring down costs and that offshore wind can be cost competitive with other technologies. And I think that story can also be applied to floating. Right now, it still looks a bit expensive, that's right, but that's exactly the same what we've seen with conventional bottom fixed offshore wind. And therefore, I would always say that the floating community can just point to the conventional community and say, we are confident that we can achieve the same as our conventional colleagues did. And therefore, I think I wouldn't specify an exact date by when exactly floating becomes cost competitive with conventional or other types of electricity generation. But I would always encourage people to have a look at the cost reduction curve for conventional offshore wind. And then I think people will find it more likely that floating offshore wind is very likely to follow a similar trajectory for their industry. And I think that is then a very positive sign for the floating offshore wind industry.
Okay. And another question, Gunnar, which companies are going to be most active in floating offshore wind industry?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think, to be honest, right now, all the big players that we currently see in the industry are already more or less active. I mean, the most prominent example is certainly Equinor from Norway, who did all the development for the Hywind project, which was first just a single floating offshore wind turbine off the coast of Norway, but has now developed into the Hywind wind farm off the coast of Scotland, which I think was a major achievement for the floating industry. Therefore, I think Equinor is already very well positioned. And actually, that also leads to an interesting story with floating offshore wind, because increasingly people are convinced that more of the offshore oil and gas companies, as is Equinor, are going to be very interested, or particularly interested, in the floating offshore wind industry, because they can use all the experience they have from floating oil and gas facilities, and therefore apply that knowledge in particular to the floating wind industry. Therefore, we could also see more oil and gas players. Shell, for example, as I already mentioned, has already created this joint venture together with Innogy from Germany and Stistal, where they develop a particular type of floating foundation. So I think that is already something that is quite interesting. So I think it's going to be, yeah, probably a mixture of some of the established players, such as Innogy, but also some of the oil and gas companies, such as Equinor, maybe Shell. But I think we will also probably see some new companies, probably some of the floating foundation manufacturers who will come up with interesting joint ventures and partnerships with other players. And therefore, I think the floating field in the future could be quite interesting, and maybe, yeah, it will definitely include quite a few players from the conventional offshore wind industry, but it could also include some new players. And therefore, I think it's a very interesting development for the industry to see how this particular branch of the offshore wind industry will develop in the future.
Okay, a question from Abigail Smith. She says, thank you for your presentation. What sort of state-level regulatory support can we expect to see in California?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, yeah, to be honest, that is still a bit too early, I would say, to say, because I think things in California have just kicked off, and BOEM has just really in October issued this call for information and nominations for those 3 areas. And I think we've now seen that there is enough interest from the industry in those projects. So I'm sure the process is going to continue. But I would say that this will indeed take some time, and it would be too early to already speculate on what kind of regulatory framework exactly they are going to implement. I think from a macro perspective, California, especially as a state, looks very positive, especially with the legislation that California is aiming at sourcing 100% of its electricity from renewables. I think that looks very promising, and California itself, I think, is yeah, obviously always a state that is very supportive of renewable energy, and therefore I think it would be not unreasonable to assume a favorable regulatory framework. But I think that will take some time for people to, yeah, detail and to really finalize and come up with a framework that then works for the industry. I think that will still take some time until we have a clearer picture on what the framework is going to look like.
Okay, Gunnar, we are inundated with questions. I'm trying to filter through and find an interesting one. So if you just give me a second, I'll come up with another one for you. One here. Do you see the Jones Act interfering with the US wind market, as most of the expertise is outside the USA?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? I didn't quite get that.
Do you see the Jones Act interfering with the US offshore wind market? I guess they're talking both fixed bottom and floating, as most of the expertise is outside of the USA.
That's really, yeah, I mean, the Jones Act is indeed always something that does come up when talking about offshore wind in the US in general, no matter whether floating or bottom fixed on the East Coast. I believe that is indeed a bit of a speciality in the US, as it yeah, complicates the installation as well as the O&M phase of a project. But I am confident, and I've heard from companies that they will come up with innovative ways to handle that, either by, yeah, finding clever ways that comply with the Jones Act, which is of course necessary, or by indeed using US vessels in what way ever. So I think it's not going to be a major showstopper or so for offshore wind in the US, but it is indeed always something that does come up, and I think companies are have already been discussing Jones Act challenges for quite some time. So I think when things really kick off on the East Coast, I would expect all the installation firms to be well prepared to be fully compliant with the Jones Act in a way that works for the industry.
Okay, Gunnar, I think that's all we've got time for. So I'd like to say thank you very much again for presenting today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the US Offshore Wind Conference in Boston next month.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm now going to hand you over to Michael Jacobson with Serco. So Michael, I'll share your screen now.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Adam, first of all, for inviting.
Okay, I think we may have lost the sound for Michael. We're going to just hang on and wait, see if Michael can rejoin us. Please bear with us. So
yeah, hello again.
Hello, Michael. Sorry we lost you there. I'm glad you're back with us. So if you could please start your presentation. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you, Adam, for inviting, for presenting at this webinar. My name is Michael Jacobson. I'm the Managing Director for Serco. Serco is probably not a very well-known name among you. Serco was founded back in 2001. It's a California-based company, and we've been active in offshore wind since then. We focus on floating wind and the large-scale turbines, next-generation turbines in relation to that. And pretty much anything on the pathway from say where we are today until the interest we have in the commercial deployments. So that means the different steps and the different activities that we need to take to get to that point. One of the activities that we are having right now here in Scotland is to work towards the first deployment of the next generation turbines off of the coast here, which could end up being the very first one in the world. And in the US side, we're obviously working, as you have seen, with the tenders for offshore wind over there. Another final thing to mention is that we are completing a cost of energy report for the UK government, which will be completed by the end of this month. And we will present this report at the Boston event. So very welcome to join there, and it will be interesting to meet you guys in person. Moving to the presentation. So what we wanted to talk about today was around the offshore wind proposition and the fact that the floating wind does indeed have a different pathway than the fixed offshore wind, and there's a lot of parallels we can draw. So I hope to explore that a little bit with you. I have some topics here on the first slide, but that's pretty much for your download to get some reading guidance. So I'll move on to the next slide. So offshore wind, is it a simple equation? Can we move into the big projects, or can we not in a hasty way, or as we are today? And I think from what Gunnar presented, we see that it will take some time. Then we have some benefits that the floating wind will see that will help us move quicker, but there's also some obstacles. And I'm going to try to lay those out both technical and a little bit on the soft side, on the legislation and what is needed and why. So on the benefits side, it is an engineering proposition. We're extremely well developed in the technical field. We have tools, we have modeling, although with floating designs, these tools may not be as validated as they could be. And obviously, as we move into bigger turbines, we will do so. But the big brother of conventional offshore wind helps us a lot in terms of supply chain, in terms of suppliers, experience, and contractors coming directly into this field. And that helps us a lot on the timing and maturity to help us accelerate that. The other aspect of it is that the conventional offshore wind have reached that low-cost capital point a couple of years back, which allowed us to progress with these lower-cost tender and bids, and that last little drop that we had in cost of energy. And this will obviously be also, we expect that to be awaiting around the corner once we have reduced the risk sufficiently for the low or for the floating wind as well. So that is a very good help. Now, interesting with offshore floating wind is different from fixed, is that we have a number of suppliers, a number of designs that can be applied in a variety of sites with benefits in different ways. So technology-wise, this is an ideal situation for independent project developers to sister together the most, say, ideal projects to reach the lowest cost of energy. And I think that is one of the intriguing things, but it does come with a caveat, which I will mention a little bit later. But we do have an extremely large leap in both technology and project scale. And this obviously adds to the whole risk proposition. We're looking now, as we are studying the cost of energy for floating wind, we see the dramatic reduction of the next generation turbines. So I think that is a prerequisite that we get into that space, and those obviously are not available there yet. The proposition of the foundation of becoming a leading component versus before, with a monopile being sort of a cookie cutter kind of device that we adapted to the turbine and to the water depth. Today is the foundation of the floater becomes a leading component. It needs to be designed and needs to be optimized and tailored. So that's a wider proposition. It will take a little bit more time, especially as we shift over both in size and scale up to the larger devices. Now, having also over 30 to 40 foundations in the market, this means also that we want to make sure that we drag out and get the best systems out there, and they need testing, and we need to have the opportunity to bring those along and really sort the top designs from this mass. And some of our colleagues out there, obviously, some of the foundation designers have been out there for a long time, and a lot of this marketplace has been driven widely by these technology companies. But that is also one of the things that we need to try to achieve in the next phase before we go into bigger projects. So looking at the next slide, we talk about the technology areas, and there's a number of them. I want to mention them because I think they're important in this proposition. There's just a number or a few of them. There's a long listing of them if we go more in detail. But the fact that we're looking at next generation turbines, we're looking at deployments past 2023, where they will come out for conventional designs. The foundation designs today and the deployed foundations for floating wind are very limited, and they are at 6 to 8 megawatt scales, 2 megawatt scales, as some of them are. And that means that there's a lot more designs out there that needs to be to come out, and then as we shift up in size. Looking at the experience base of floating projects, so if we look at high wind, an Equinor project of 30 megawatt, with one foundation design, and we look at the, say, first runner-up is a 6 megawatt turbine, this is a very thin basis for us to jump into the big game, although it's very close, it's very intriguing. Looking on the electrical side, the other areas is we're talking about 12 megawatt plus turbines, and it will not stop there. We expect the turbines to come from 12 to maybe 17, 18 megawatt turbines very quickly after first deployment as a part of optimization process. But that means that the grid concept or the line grid for the array cabling that we've had for 33 kilovolt with the 6 to 8 megawatt machines went and became or allowed too few turbines to put on the line. Well, we're now starting to install 66 kV systems that allows more turbines, but if we put those 12 to 15 megawatt or 12 to 17 megawatt turbines on there, we have exactly the same proposition again. So we need to take another step. And that is not defined or how we go about that. That also weaves in a little bit to the transformer station and how do we manage a floating transformer station. And there's good companies out there looking at designs, but there is this proposition of how we take that off. Can we do it? How do we deal with high voltage cabling in a flexible environment where turbine is moving around, or a turbine, but the foundation is moving around? That's also an area of technology that we need to get behind this. The last point on this slide is more pertaining to the fabrication strategy of the floater. And I think we have had experience with the monopiles, which became sort of cookie cutter at low cost, and it was sort of a simplified approach that we could optimize cost-wise. Well, then the jackets came in, and we struggled to get the cost downs on jackets, and we need to get those into serial fabrication. And some companies today, they are there, they can do that. But the floating proposition, the floating foundation, some of these foundations, when we look at 12 megawatt designs, they are the size of a soccer field. And that means to make a serial production of such, to build a very large project, that's going to take some time and some planning and infrastructure planning, which is not there today. But this is just to highlight some of the areas. Now, shifting over and maybe having California a bit in perspective, shifting over to the legislation and what is it we're about to do. And California, and there was a question earlier about the support that the state of California can offer. California is an extremely complex place, and California is a complex environment because of the way it's structured, or the grid connectivity, the high winds, and all those things. So as we require these legislations to come in place in order for us to, in a robust way, take the projects forward, we need to be able to propose an acceptable proposition to the legislators to actually take that forward. And that means we need to have fact. We need to gather reliable and robust information so that process can take place. And we know how it's very difficult and challenging to take legislations forward, because it's a very highly political environment, and also it needs to get the support in order to go through into legislation. So it's not a simple equation, but this slide is sort of to highlight that we need to take that forward and have a robust proposition. Now, if we start breaking that down a little bit, and if with California in mind, it needs to be politically arguable that this is something we need to do. And I think what we talked about here earlier about the cost of offshore wind and what it will be, well, if we do have high wind sites, if we do have the larger turbines, and if we do build larger projects, well, maybe we are in the range of 7 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour, rather than what the perception is today of 15 to maybe, or say $15 to $18 a megawatt hour, so $7 to $8 a megawatt hour versus 13 to maybe $18 a megawatt hour. And this has to be taken in context with the fact that we're not competing with other offshore wind, we are competing with the other renewable energy sources. So we have geothermal, we have other wind, we have also solar with storage. They all come in around 5 cents. So that's sort of the gap where we need to make sure that the legislation can cover. But that's the important thing here, is that we need to be able to demonstrate that that gap is in fact true, and how we get to that gap. And that really needs to be done through real projects where also we have the ability to engage with the various interests, with fishermen, with our Department of Defense, and to allow us to engage maybe and not it's creating a little bit fear in a lot of different interest groups in the fact that we're talking about gigawatt projects, where maybe we should talk about these first projects and how we can make sure that we anchor this well in those communities. So there are these next, say, projects needed, which I will come back to a little bit later. Now, in order to demonstrate the cost of energy reduction, we cannot do this with the existing turbine class. It's just not enough. We need to get the next generation turbine out there to make this very clear and to tick off those boxes that we need to tick off and make sure that we do have a robust proposition and we are ready for that gigawatt deployment with the right technologies. And so there's a roadmap to get there. So what I wanted to do was to maybe put this in perspective of what we have experienced so far with the conventional floating wind. And here's a very high level timeline, starting from the very first offshore turbine, which I happened to be involved in back in 1989. Vindeby was the first wind farm in Denmark in 1991. Another highlight was the first deployment of 1.5 and 2 megawatt machines. That was in 2001. 2005, we have the 5 megawatt. And if we look at the larger size projects, they started to come about 10 years after we have launched the 1.5 and 2 megawatt machines. So we see that there's sort of a timeline in this, and where we need to have this time to actually, although we are piggybacking on the big brother of conventional offshore wind, floating needs to get its time to mature into that space. And that's very important. Now, if we do take a look at how does floating fit into this, we can see that the experience base is obviously very, very thin. And as we are talking about gigawatt projects already today, we can understand that some people are fearful of can you really manage that? And therefore, I think we need to be careful and trot carefully. And we don't by any means want to sound negative, but we do need to do this right, because we will get only one chance. We can't have a failing project of large scale, for instance. So very important. But if we maybe try to understand how does this fit in with the evolution that we have had? Well, when we look at where we are today, I think we probably end up somewhere where we were in 2002 on the fixed foundations. And what you'd see is that the next turbine, the 5 megawatt at that time, is around the corner with a couple of years. Bigger projects is going to be later down the line, and we have a very thin basis for experience. And I think this is maybe a starting point to understand what do we need to do in order to get into the waters. So you also see on this timeline up on the right-hand side those various turbines and when they are expected to come in the market. Some of them are still sort of based on the old platforms, some of them closer to the next generation or larger turbines of, say, 200 meters diameter, and then we have turbines of 220 and above. And that's where we need to get to, where the optimization of floater becomes much more efficient. So if you take a look at them on a timeline and see, so what can we do with this? I think the deployment of these units, we need to piggyback on that and get a first round of projects out there. And these are the projects like the Beatrice project or the Utgrunden project, or these projects where we got a few units out there. We can test them off. We can engage with a variety of parties, environment, interest groups, and others, and most of all, be able to get a picture of the cost of energy potential. And that needs to weave in then to the process and the legislative process and the process whether to make use of the California wind resource, to what extent, because if that's going to be a greater extent, well, it's inevitable that we need to have a grid build out for the northern region where the winds are high. Now, the first deployment needs to be succeeded by a number of, say, zero series deployments. So we're talking about turbines of, or say 7, 5, 6, 7, or fewer or more turbines of that size. So basically what we categorize as a zero series deployment, which is sort of the last step to get a critical mass before you deploy a bigger project. And this is to tick off the boxes for the low cost capital. And then we can be ready to deploy these gigawatt projects. And that's obviously more globally, but also in the US. But to summarize and just look at the conclusions and maybe the suggestions here, obviously California has a vast area of wind resource, high wind resource. The whole northern area in the hub heights, we're talking about 10, 11 meters per second wind speeds. They're ideal. There is a different proposition of the floating here that we need to consider, and we need to get our time, but we can piggyback on the fixed offshore wind, and that is a help. The grid connectivity, that is something which politically needs to be looked at. What do we want to do? And I think the slide here that Gunnar presented, where we look at 500 gigawatts from 2030 to 2050, or 2020 to 2050, that's a pretty compelling picture. But that's all driven by political decisions and what we are willing, to what extent we're willing to support. But that needs to be taking place, and that will take its time also. So in that period, we do need to make sure that we can work and build up the case and the platform for the floating wind to be ready for that bigger deployment. So if we look on the second part of this last slide, if we conclude that we do match up and align pretty much with the 2002 scenario for conventional wind, we will need another 10 years. So talking about 10 years from today, we're talking about 2030 deployment, as we saw on the previous slide. And I think that's realistic. With that time frame, we can work with supply chain, we can evolve technology, we can tick off the risk boxes. In this picture, the cost of energy reduction is absolutely fundamental. It needs to identify the gap. And this gap, as we've talked about, they are different from the northern part of California to the southern part, or say the Morro Bay and the Diablo Canyon projects, where the wind speeds are a couple of meters per second lower. So that obviously is going to be very challenging to reach those optimized cost of energy levels, which means if we're going to build there, we're going to need a higher support than if we needed in the north, while we need the grid connection up north. So it's a little bit of an equation. But bottom line, in the conclusion, we are a strong believer of a stepwise approach. We do think that if we can accelerate a few smaller demonstration projects with distinctive purposes of validation, produce the evidence of cost reduction, reduce the risks, and really show technology validation, and allow us to collaborate with competing interests. All of this will build acceptance, and we will have a much more sustainable environment to deploy in. And I think there will be a more long-term possibility here for a larger scale deployment than if we maybe rush into it without having our ducks in a row. So with that, I want to thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to hearing questions.
So yeah, Michael, thank you very much. A question for you. As you mentioned, the need for next generation turbine class. What is the cost of energy difference comparing 6 megawatt turbine class with the next generation?
This is very interesting, and it was maybe more unexpected as we started digging into the details of it. And now obviously we were going to talk about this more when we in the presentation in Boston, but we can see, depending on the turbine size, because if you take a Vestas 9 versus a Aliad 6, but if we are in the 6 megawatt class, we see up to 50% cost of energy reduction if you look at that turbine on a floater versus a large scale turbine on a floater. There's a massive difference, unexpected.
Okay. And in the California case, how would you see localities for deployment of demonstration projects in relation to commercial projects?
Yeah, I think the good thing now is obviously that there are sites that have been asked for, say the expression of interest for, but the question is how we do go about it. There's always the risk in a market where we're trying to stake claims and that we end up sitting on projects until the market is there, and maybe the value of sites are higher if the technology proposition is closer to executable. And that could be an argument that we would, that maybe Boeing would look at a demonstration site process, accelerate that, and we could use existing site areas for different and various deployments for demonstration. So Morro Bay and both Morro Bay and Diablo Canyon could probably be very suitable to deploy a couple of these projects each, and hereby allow to progress maybe quicker and still be ready for large-scale developments and deployments. But that's one scenario one could look at.
And in relation to other interests and collaborations, what do you mean exactly?
Well, today the two projects, for instance, in the south are in the middle of the Department of Defense interest area, range operations. There are several interests that are sometimes opposing or are very negative towards it. To be able to collaborate with Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, departments within the U.S. government, together with fishermen, which are extremely important in working with and in a stepwise approach, not to pour a cold bucket of water, which I don't think it will be, but nevertheless. So these collaborative engagements could lead to, say, collaborative activities could lead to cooperations, perhaps longer term, rather than maybe fears and opposition. Does that make sense?
Yeah. A question from Malik Haynes. What is the scope for the East Coast? I think Malik mentions the main Aquaventus. Could you tell us a bit more about the East Coast and what's happening there?
East Coast of the U.S.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So Sierco, we have been focused more on the West Coast because it is a straightforward floating proposition. The East Coast is indeed more of a competition with existing offshore wind. And with our resources and the focus we have in California, that's where we have started. So we haven't penetrated the East Coast proposition yet, but we will, but not at this time to the extent that I want to pretend to be wise about it.
Okay. And one from Alan Baker. Societe Generale are advising Equinor on the Hywind Scotland project, but do you think the finance community will be able to fund floating on the same or similar terms to fixed bottom offshore wind to get the industry going?
I think that the finance community are already interested in floating and finance floating, but if we can get to the same terms, I do not think so. Personally, I don't think that we can get the low-cost capital to come in. The interest and the risk capital on a floater in an early stage will be aligned with the interest rates for the risk proposition, and I think that's probably aggressive to expect. Then it could be, or say, other mechanisms, if it's EIB through Innofin or other sort of finance mechanisms that could allow low-cost capital to come in, but not the conventional finance community, I believe. Not yet, at least, but later for sure.
Okay. Well, Michael, I just before you go, maybe could you tell us a little bit about the presentation you'll be giving at the Boston conference next month? Sure.
So Sierco has a contract with the UK government with BASE to look at floating wind and fixed wind and two blades, the turbines and three-bladed turbines, and on a side-by-side comparison, looking at different sites and to see the cost of energy, the levelized cost of energy. And that is a work that's been going on, and it is based on real designs. So turbine foundations, pilings, is all based on real design. So even when we're talking about the 12 megawatt class, we are talking about real data coming into the model. So I would say it's a relatively robust proposition that will very much indicate where the costs will be in various environments. So that is what we are launching, and we will present a report or the findings of the report at this Boston event. So we're looking forward to that and to share with the community what we have learned.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much for your time and your presentation. We really enjoyed that. So thank you very much. I'll now introduce our next speaker, Antoine Pfeiffer, with Principal Power. So, just a quick note to the audience, thanks a lot. I'm getting a lot of questions coming in. Apologies I couldn't get through all of those, but I believe the contact details for the presenters will be provided after, so you can reach out to them. So over to you, Antoine.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity. I'm really delighted to be presented on this webinar today. I think it's a really exciting time, and floating wind is really emerging as an energy resource with huge potential for the supply of clean electricity at large utility scale. My goal today is to give you an overview of the floating wind industry, and most importantly, for people who are listening today, I would like to answer the following question: why should you care about floating wind, and why is floating wind relevant to the US energy landscape as a whole? So let me start off with some background information about Principal Power. We are a technology and services company for the deep water offshore wind industry. And we have developed a floating foundation technology called the WindFloat that is now patented and one of the leading technologies on the market. We are a California company with offices in France and Portugal, so we have a global presence. We had to set up offices there initially because Europe is really where we got traction when we were demonstrating the viability of our technology. I also want to mention that we are backed by large energy players like EDP, Repsol, and more recently Aker Solutions. And really the main goal of the company is to expand the potential of offshore wind and to really globalize offshore wind. It's really about pushing the boundaries of offshore wind and in a sense to have a technology that is not limited by water depth constraints in the ocean and that competes with other sources of energy, both renewable or fossil fuel based. So, the first question is why do we want to do floating wind, and how does that fit in the sort of offshore wind equation? Well, I think a major argument is that floating wind can be deployed further from shore in areas of stronger, more consistent wind resource, resulting in greater generation potential. So basically higher capacity factors. And if these wind farms can be deployed further from shore, that means you can actually avoid a lot of the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard effect, or actually here you can call it NEMO, not in my ocean effect. They provide more flexibility basically in the siting process than bottom fixed foundations. Obviously, and that is more generally true for offshore wind as a whole, energy generation is close to where people live. We have substations, transmission infrastructure, coastal power plants scheduled to be decommissioned that have used the end of their lives. So there's lots of existing infrastructure that offshore wind can make economic use of, basically. I think also the main reason to go floating is that bottom fixed foundations are significantly limited by water depths and ground conditions. So at some point, if you look at the graph on the bottom right-hand side, we have to move from left to right. On the left, you can see the status of the industry with bottom fixed foundations like monopiles and jackets, but there is an inflection point when you look at the cost. And at a water depth of around 40 to 50 meters, floating foundations become actually more cost competitive. So floating can really expand the potential of offshore wind, and it's a game changer in two ways. In transitional water depths between 45 and 60 meters, floating wind can really improve the cost competitiveness of offshore wind by providing a cheaper alternative than bottom fixed foundations. And floating wind actually opens coastal markets with high power demand, high prices, high population density, and deep waters. Here I'm talking more than the 60 meter of water depths, and there is no technological limitation to the depth of a given deployment for floating. It becomes more of an economical consideration, really. So just to elaborate a little bit on the technology that we have developed at Principal Power over the past 10 years. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel. We are leveraging existing know-how and knowledge from very well-established industries that have been around for more than 30 years and that have a track record. I'm talking about the oil and gas industry and the wind energy industry. All floating wind concepts developed around the world belong to different types of floating foundations, borrowed from the oil and gas industry, like the spar, the tension leg platform, or the semi-submersible type. Our technology is based on the semi-submersible type. It's a platform. It's a semi-submersible platform, basically on boosters. The innovation here lies in the marriage of the hydrodynamics of the floater and the aerodynamics of the turbine. And really the philosophy is to reduce the cost and the risk at all stages of the life cycle of a project. The wind float is designed to be fabricated, deployed, and operated efficiently. In this world, no technology will survive unless it holistically looks at its performance throughout the entire life cycle. The platform is very stable at different drafts. That means how much it's actually in the water. So we can do all the assembly and turbine erection work at quayside, onshore, in a very controlled environment. Some of the concepts have to go offshore and finalize some of the assembly operations offshore. That is very expensive. And the reason is that we don't need to charter very expensive and specialized offshore vessels with very high capacity cranes. That actually needs to be Jones Act compliant in the US. We finalize the assembly and the pre-commissioning at quayside, and we tow the platform to its sites, and we can hook it up to its motor line and electrical cable. This operation can be performed with very conventional tugboats, and that's much cheaper. So now, how did we actually demonstrate the maturity of the technology? Well, we had a full life cycle demonstration project in Portugal from 2011 to 2016. It was a full-scale unit with a 2 megawatt turbine installed 6 kilometers offshore, and it operated successfully for 5 years. What really came out of this project is that the turbine on the wind float really felt like it was on a monopile or a jacket. We performed according to the power curve of the wind turbine manufacturer. We operated as expected up to the 1-year storm at rated power, and we withstood extreme events, large waves, high winds. And we learned from this project and incorporated these learnings for the next stage that we call pre-commercial. We are currently executing on 3 pre-commercial projects. You can see 2 on the slide here. They are small wind farms of multiple units in the range of 25 to 50 megawatts. For this project, we are using 8.3 megawatt and 9.5 megawatt turbines, basically the largest commercially available turbine on the market. And we are working with large energy players, which really shows the maturity of the space. These projects either are or will be project financed, meaning that commercial debt providers, so very conservative money, have had all their questions about technical status and performance satisfactorily answered. So while the prototype project was about proving the viability of the technology, this pre-commercial stage was really about proving the bankability of the technology. So to sum up, by 2021, if everything goes well, Principal Power should have 100 megawatts of floating wind installed in Europe. The most advanced project is called Windfloat Atlantic. Here is a picture that was taken a month ago, where you can see units being assembled in the yard. Deployment of the 3 units is planned for this summer, so that's really exciting for us, as we are always trying to catch up with Equinor and the successful 30 megawatt wind farm in Scotland. They deploy the first full-scale unit, and we deploy the second full-scale unit. And here again, we are following their footsteps with the second floating wind farm again installed until this summer. And we will also be actually present in Scotland, but it's going to be next year with the Windfloat Kinkerline project. And so that begs also the question, what's next after this pre-commercial phase? And I would say a few years ago, floating wind was still seen as a very experimental and risky, kind of like a futuristic idea. Investors were interested, but found the idea quite risky and were really reluctant to do anything about it. This has changed completely. The industry is here. Floating wind is real. In this period of urgency to adopt more and more renewable energy around the world, as we are looking to secure a clean and sustainable future, time forces us to progress to the next stage of the industry, the commercial stage. A number of commercial projects are progressing through the pipeline in global markets. Right now, the industry is on track to deploy 10 gigawatts of floating wind by 2030. We are definitely following the same path of execution, and we're trying to be active all across the globe, and we're working on establishing a pipeline of commercial projects. Very quickly, I would say that France, the UK, Japan, Korea, and the US are all really front runners in the race to create an established floating wind energy industry, and each have pilot demonstration and commercial projects in abundance. Now, I would like to zoom in on the US market and talk about why floating wind will be a key driver here. First of all, the offshore wind resource is tremendous. Many reports from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, have shown that floating wind would unlock sites with world-class wind resources that are in deeper waters. Also, floating wind imposes less stringent requirements on installation vessels that should be Jones Act compliant. Basically, no need for these specialized heavy lift vessels, like jack-up vessels, that are currently unavailable in the US. That simplifies logistics. Finally, floating wind offers an opportunity to develop in-state renewable energy for coastal states instead of importing renewables from out of state. Building long-range transmission lines and bringing energy from out-of-state places like Wyoming and Colorado to California, for instance, prevents both political and environmental risks. The East Coast is definitely taking the lead on offshore bottom fixed shallow water projects on the outer continental shelf, which we touched on it a little bit earlier. First offshore wind was deployed in Block Island in 2016, and many projects are on the way. There are actually 15 BOEM leases that have been granted for sites in different states. There are very ambitious targets also from all these different states that add up to multiple gigawatts of offshore wind. But there will still be plenty of space for floating in the next wave of sites that will be in water depths greater than 50 meters. As a matter of fact, you can see here, according to NREL, approximately 58% of the US offshore wind resource area is in water greater than 60 meters of depth. And for the Atlantic region alone, the percent of resource area that is in water greater than 60 meters is actually 61%, which is greater than the national average. So we really hope that the future sites going for lease will be floating sites. All these things can be translated to the West Coast. Fundamentals are the same between the two coasts or Hawaii, actually. Floating wind is still offshore wind. The main differences are on the West Coast, whether it's California or Hawaii, only floating technology is viable because of the very steep drop-off of the outer continental shelf. In California, what's interesting is what you call the duck curve phenomenon. The offshore wind resource has a load matching characteristic, and it can help penetration of solar during the day and limit the fast ramp up of fossil fuel plants when the sun sets. It's very helpful from a system perspective, and as the state moves towards the procurement of 100% of renewable energy by 2045. In any case, the opportunity is immense. Projects have already been proposed for the central and northern coast of the state, and a recent report produced by the American Jobs Project that the industry could employ more than 17,000 people and provide close to 20 gigawatts of capacity to the grid by 2040. previous reports from the National Renewable Energy Lab have actually projected very similar numbers. So it's clear that offshore wind is a high capacity product, producing energy in a way and at times that is complementary to the solar resource in the state, and that it carries the potential to generate significant new economic activities and jobs. Michael touched on that. Developers and global energy companies, from Germany, Norway, definitely see California as a large floating market that is coming to fruition. There is obviously still some work to navigate through regulatory and policy landscape, but by the middle of the next decade, we can say that the floating industry is really expected to lift off all over the map. And I would like here to end on a note of optimism with one of the projects that we are currently developing in partnership in California. It's an interesting model for an infrastructure project that is really coming together in Humboldt County. So that's on the Northern California coast. There are transmission challenges up there, but the wind resource offshore is really world-class. The Redwood Coast Energy Authority, RCEA, understood the potential and took a fascinating position a few years ago with a very strong will to develop the potential of this untapped resource. For context, RCEA is a local joint powers authority, so it's a public organization administered by the county and the surrounding cities that has had a community choice aggregator, a CCA program, in place basically since 2017. So they are now basically the load serving entity in Humboldt County, responsible for local electricity generation. With them, we are creating a unique type of partnership for an energy project. It's a public-private partnership with two other private companies, EDPR and Aker Solutions. And the idea is to construct and deploy and operate a first commercial floating project of 100 to 150 megawatts, with most likely 12 megawatt turbines by the time steel gets in the water, which we expect is going to be 2024 or 2025. We also feel that the port of Humboldt Bay, which is underutilized at this stage and actually offers a lot of upland infrastructure and space, could eventually become a hub for the upcoming floating wind industry on the West Coast. We obviously need to drive some investments to improve the current facilities, but the port itself already comes with a nice suite of advantages. So we really see a high potential to revitalize the infrastructure, to serve future projects and induce local economic benefits. So I'm gonna stop here, Adam. I really thank you everyone for your attention today, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Antoine. So we see that the main benefit of floating wind is that it opens new markets in deeper waters. Could you tell us about some of the other benefits of going floating versus bottom fixed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think another main benefit is really the reduced environmental impacts that floating wind can provide. For instance, with floating wind, there is no piling into the seabed, which reduces a lot of the sort of acoustic emissions during the installation of the units. It also requires a lot less geotechnical work. We don't need to basically sample each location in the wind farm. We can sample just a few locations and look at it from a sort of average perspective. So basically, it also offers you, I think, the opportunity to site, projects with greater flexibility. You're not limited to a band of water, basically, that is between 0 and 50 meters. And so with that flexibility, you can be more responsive, I think, to the stakeholder concerns. You can basically move a project in a slightly different area because, if it's 60 meters or if it's 200 meters, it's not going to make such a significant difference from a floating technology perspective. So I think we can really prioritize some of the stakeholder concerns. And at the same time, obviously, the main advantage here is that you can go for the best wind resource in a given place. So basically higher capacity factors.
Okay, and next question. What is going to happen when the turbines get larger and larger. Is that potentially a challenge for floating systems, and how does that compare with bottom fixed foundations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we think that actually for floating, the bigger the turbine, the better. Offshore wind works very well with the economies of scale, and for floating, really, what's interesting is that the vessel requirements for installation do not really change with the size of the turbine, because you're able to do everything onshore at quayside in a controlled environment. So when you look at bottom fixed foundations, if you have larger turbines, that means you need to be able to lift components higher in the air offshore, which will basically drive the requirements of the vessels, the jackup vessels that you need to perform this installation. For us, we just need an onshore high capacity crane, and those are much easier, much easier to mobilize, I guess, in the US. So, I think for floating, actually, the better, the bigger, the better, basically.
Okay. And we hear a lot about floating wind being the only solution in California because of the steep drop off of the outer continental shelf. Can you tell us a bit more about what is happening on the East Coast? I know Michael touched on this earlier, but do you see potential for floating foundations there as well?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit about it. I think that right now the industry is really focused on fixed foundation deployments, but in a way, we see that the next wave of projects will be in water depths that are really compelling for floating wind. And I think the fundamental difference between the two is really, again, in the supply chain and the vessel requirements. So it would be interesting to see, for example, in the next wave of projects, to see hybrid projects, which would basically be composed of, fixed foundations in shallower waters and floating foundations, for instance, in slightly deeper waters. And that would be a way, I think, for developers to start maybe looking at having a more efficient supply chain and really understanding, the benefits of floating.
Okay. So looking at some audience questions, Timora Freeman Stanet has asked, is there progress being made on the development of installation guidelines and restrictions with regard to floating projects?
Installation guidelines. Well, basically, we know those projects are usually classed, so we are following guidelines from certification companies and certification bodies, like, for example, the American Bureau of Shipping in the US, and so those rules are already in place right now. So that's typically what we use for design, and it basically has all the requirements that you need for installation as well. So it's already in place in the US.
Yeah. And Sean McLaughlin, he asks, your system seems to have lots of moving parts with ballasting systems, etc. What does the O&M cost profile look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The OPEX for an offshore wind project is typically between 20 and 30% of the total project cost. What we see actually with floating here is that because we have a sort of a quick connect disconnect system on the wind float, we have the possibility to actually disconnect the platform from its mooring line and electrical cable, and we can bring it back to shore at the sort of same facility where we initially assembled the turbine, and we can perform those large corrective operations on shore. So that means that we don't need to mobilize again those very expensive heavy lift vessels that would need to go offshore and perform the same operation offshore. So actually we see a lot of potential to really reduce the OPEX of a project because of this quick connect and disconnect capability that we have now on our system.
Okay. And does Principal Power have a preferred mooring or anchoring technology like drag anchors, suction piles, driven piles?
Yeah, so the idea here is to really minimize the environmental impacts. So we prefer the types of anchors that can be removed easily at the end of a project and that do not leave any footprint, on the seabed. So that's one thing. But obviously, every site has different soil conditions and different water depths, and really the choice of the anchors and the mooring technology is going to depend on those factors. So we need to be conscious of the environmental aspects, but at the same time we also need to find the most cost-effective and optimized mooring solution for the project. So we use all types of anchors basically that are available depending on the project.
Okay. I think just one more question, Antoine. Due to higher metation conditions, California shouldn't pay more attention to reliability than LCOE. I think it's supposed to say, should California pay more attention to reliability than LCOE?
Should California pay attention to more reliability than LCOE, meaning because of the extreme conditions offshore?
Yeah.
Well, so those systems are designed. The wind float is designed according to the meteocean conditions at the site. So we basically take into account those very extreme events, very large storms, and we actually design up to the 500-year storm. So those are very extreme conditions. And so what's going to happen between, I would say, a mild site or sort of a more rough site like in California is really it's just going to drive a little bit the amount of steel that you're going to need on your foundation. But this is not a drastic increase in LCOE. And so the bottom line is, we design for whatever conditions we see. And we will even go into, for example, if you go into areas where you have typhoons, the platform will be designed also for those conditions. And thank God we don't have typhoons in California.
Okay. Well, Antoine, I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much for your presentation, and we'll look forward to seeing you in Boston next month. And on that note, thank you very much, and we'll see you then.
Thank you very much, Adam. My pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. So, as you all know, the floating wind is one of the many discussions that will be addressed at the US Offshore Wind Conference in Boston. That's June 10th and the 11th. So please join us at the event. I'm going to now hopefully leave you with a quick promo video for the US Offshore Wind 2019 conference and exhibition, just in case you want to get a feel for what that will be like. So I'm just going to play that now.